And thank you so much for that warm welcome. And I want to add my welcome to all of you. Welcome to Space City. Really glad to have all of you here. Thank you so much for coming. I want to take you back to a moment in time and mention that I've had a couple missions in space. I've spent over 200 days orbiting the planet, but I want to take you back with me to a very specific moment in time, almost exactly 3 years ago. So we were more than halfway through the mission. At that point, I'd been away from my family and my home planet for over 120 days. And it's kind of the point in the mission where you might see a little bit of wear and tear on the crew and on our interactions with the ground. Energy is flagging a little bit. And it happened to be, for me, a milestone birthday that I was spending away from my family. It was also a really big day for another reason. I had to capture an uncrewed spacecraft that had 8,000 pounds of cargo that was, it's scientific equipment, it's our food, it's all of these things. It's the way we do what we do in space. I had spent countless hours practicing to do this. It's a very delicate operation, though, and I knew that there was a lot of important equipment on there. They fly up empty freezers for us so that we can send our science samples home. They send air and water and clothing and food, of course, all of the things that we need to do the cutting-edge research that we're up there to do. So both spaceships are traveling around the Earth at 17,500 miles per hour, and I have to control this robotic arm. And it kind of, if you're not really smooth on the controls, it has a tendency to oscillate quite a bit. So I had to move this robotic arm out to grab a hold of this uncrewed spacecraft. And I'm thinking to myself in this moment, I wonder what kind of ice cream they put in the science freezers. And are we going to be able to find it in time for my birthday party tonight? It's a very human experience, right? The enjoyment of good food experienced together in community. It happens every place where humans gather on Earth and in space. We comfort one another during hard times, and we celebrate achievements. We introduce our culture with our favorite foods. In space, we live in this very tiny, isolated community in a very, very hostile environment. We're very aware that our lives depend on each other's actions. And we come from many different countries. And in some cases, we have spent very little time together before we become roommates in space. So this is the way, from the beginning of the mission, we're sharing our best and rarest food treats with one another in order to build that community. At our very first dinner party, we would have dinner parties every week, crossover from either go to the Russians or they would come to our house. And we do that every week. When our very first dinner party, they had just had a cargo vehicle arrive. And every time you get this very small allotment of fresh fruit. I'm talking a bag that's about, I don't know if y'all can see me way back there, but about the size of a bread box full of fresh fruit. And they took one of their grapefruit and they portioned it equally amongst all 7 of us and gave everybody a piece of it. And I cannot tell you how amazing it smelled and tasted in that enclosed artificial environment. And so how could you ever be mad at someone that's going to give what may be the only grapefruit they see in 6 months and they're going to give you a share of it? It's pretty amazing. That's the power of good food to build community. And that's what all of you help people to do by sharing your talent and your passion for good food. So thank you for that. You've heard this week you're going to have the opportunity to build your community of mutually supportive teammates and strengthen your leadership skills. So I was asked to talk with you about our shared experience of being women leaders in a historically male-dominated culture. The great news from where I sit at NASA is that we have actively grown and supported people from all backgrounds in order to field a more diverse leadership team. I believe that this diversity of thought and experience helps us achieve more robust solutions to the challenging problems that all of us face. And I suspect it's the same in your community as well. So I applaud your efforts here as well. An interesting side effect of that effort, though, is that I didn't necessarily set out to be a leader. Sure, I wanted to be an astronaut, right? And there's an element of leadership just by filling that role. And in general, I tend to stay away from stereotypes, but I have experienced this one, that women often won't put themselves forward for a leadership role or for a specific job unless we can check every single one of the requirements on that job list, right? So I've been fortunate to have bosses who really believed in my potential and selected me for leadership. We call that being voluntold. I don't know if that happens to you. But it happens to me. And so I've been placed into roles where I've supervised dozens of astronauts, many of whom were senior to me. I've been placed in charge of a multi-$100 million operating budget without having had the chance to start with like a cute little $10 million budget. So I'm here to tell you, you don't have to know it all when you start. You can do a job you haven't been specifically trained for. You can lead even if you didn't expect to. So if you're like me and you found yourself in a leadership role because you're passionate about what you do and passionate about wanting to serve the community that you believe in, how do you sally forth through your own doubts and maybe even real knowledge gaps to be an effective leader? Without the benefit of structured leadership training like what you might get in military service, I never served in the military, how do you develop an effective leadership style? The key, of course, is that there's lots of effective styles. We often hear that men have a more authoritative leadership style, and I've certainly seen that style demonstrated in my years at NASA, often working for men whose careers began in the military. Women, of course, are said to have a more nurturing and empathetic leadership style, but I've also worked for some tough as nails civilian women who run Mission Control Center at NASA, and they make it look as easy as breathing. They're not giving out a lot of hugs either. Possibly one of my favorite bosses is the most empathetic leader that I've ever known. He was a former Army officer and graduate of Ranger School, Army helicopter pilot, a super empathetic guy. And so as a result, my leadership style is kind of a blend of my own personal instincts that I've had to learn to dial up or dial down to serve the situation, combined with techniques that I've seen from other leaders over the years. Sometimes it feels natural, sometimes I have to really work at it. A lot of what I've learned about how to be an effective leader has come from the daily life lessons about how to be a successful astronaut. In the Astronaut Corps, we talk about expeditionary behavior, or EB, how to conduct yourself when you're in a remote, stressful environment, working with a team to accomplish the goal. The 5 elements of expeditionary behavior are communication, leadership and followership, team care, self-care, super important, and group living. You're going to hear more about this mindset tomorrow from Ann Hernandez. Wave, Ann. There's Ann. She's the Director of Leadership Programs and Inclusion at Space Center Houston. I have the pleasure of working with her there. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of elements because I don't want to keep you all standing here away from the food for too long, but I have a couple stories to share with you, elements that have been important to me on my journey. So the first one for me, communication. Clear, appropriate communication. This can mean a lot of things, of course. It can mean providing clear direction to your team, communicating your expectations. These are all super important things. But for me, what it has really meant is how to be a better listener. Communication has to go both ways, transmit and receive. So very early in my career, I had a job that was advocating for the needs of astronauts who were living aboard the space station. This was before I had ever been there. And I was in a meeting with the people who provide psychological support. And one of the doctors is a psychiatrist. He looked at me and he said, "Megan, I love having meetings with you because you just come in with your samurai sword and you go, 'This is what I think.'" I was like, okay, let me think about that for a minute. And he later was my psychiatrist when I was in space, so we've had this wonderful, long friendship, and I know that I can literally say anything to him, which is great. But I've thought about that remark a lot over the years, and it's helped me to realize that even though I might be really passionate about something, and I'm convinced that I'm right, if my delivery shuts down the discussion, it's not actually helpful, right? So this is especially important when I'm the leader in the room, when I'm trying to lead my team to solve a challenging problem. I try to never lead with my own opinion or my own solution to the problem, and I have to get comfortable with silence. Because I really want the woman at the way back of the room who has something to say to feel comfortable saying it, especially if she disagrees with what I'm saying. The other thing that I owe my team is an open and honest two-way feedback channel, right? I think as collectively as humans, we're super bad at this. Giving and receiving feedback, in my experience, we're terrible at this. Either we're too concerned with hurting feelings, or maybe we're not concerned enough with hurting feelings. Hitting that sweet spot to inspire change can feel impossible sometimes. So again, this is a thing that I've thought about a lot in my roles, and it's something that I'm always working on. But there are some basic guidelines that I try to follow. So feedback should be specific, actionable, and unemotional. So what that means is if I'm trying to coach someone maybe who's struggling as a robotic arm operator, it doesn't help if I say, "You're terrible at this, you're lazy, you need to work harder." Or what are they going to do with that, right? So what might be more helpful, right, is something specific, actionable, unemotional. So, hey, your hand controller technique is making the arm oscillate all over the place. You're making your job harder. Let's book some time in the simulator and work on some techniques together. So that shows that I'm interested, that I'm invested, that I know they can learn the skill. The other piece of that, of course, is that two-way communication, that two-way feedback. I have to solicit for that feedback. As the leader, if it's another astronaut, they're probably not going to have a problem telling me what they think of me. But oftentimes people are not willing to give astronauts feedback. And so I can't just say, hey, my door is always open. Stop by and tell me what you think. I have to say, hey, here's the thing I'm working on. I'm working on being a better active listener. Do you have any suggestions for me? And that way, I'm investing in my team. I'm showing them that I really care about what their input is. Because for me, team care, number 2, team care is where the heart of the matter is. As a leader, you cannot achieve your mission if your team can't function individually and collectively. So this is about treating people, with patience and respect, earning their trust and promoting their growth and achievement. When the space shuttle retired, this is going back a few years, but when the space shuttle retired, it was huge operational, organizational, and really emotional change for my community. The space shuttle operated for 30 years. So the entire first half of my career was shaped in that era. The way we hired astronauts, the way we trained astronauts, really our very identity as astronauts. We had this other thing called space station, but really the focus in my organization was about space shuttle. So then when the space shuttle retired, suddenly we don't have a rocket. We don't have a way to get American astronauts on an American rocket to the International Space Station. We went from flying 8 shuttle missions in my first year as an astronaut, 50 people, to flying 1 or 2 astronauts with the Russians in a given year. So that's a huge change. But of course, we kept hiring new astronauts. We kept training them to work aboard the space station, again, in 1s or 2s. But those of us who had been around for a while, we kind of lost track of the fact that we'd shaped our identity and culture with the space shuttle, and that wasn't part of the experience for these new folks. So when I was first selected for a mission, I spent hundreds of hours with other astronauts operating the space shuttle simulator to train both ourselves and the flight controllers. We no longer had that as part of our training regimen. So with it, we lost the ability to build community through that shared experience and pass on the lessons learned. At this point, though, I was in a leadership role supervising all the astronauts who hadn't yet flown in space. And in conversations with them, I learned that they felt adrift in some ways. And while I felt we had this strong, enveloping culture of this community of astronauts, they really only felt comfortable with the people they'd been hired with. They didn't feel like they were part of this bigger family. They spent almost no time with people senior to them. So to correct that, we developed the concept, we called it Astronauts Ready Room. And we could gather for planned seminars or just informal collaborations. I made the creation of the space a team activity, so we all had a feeling of ownership in the space. And I started inviting our retired astronauts to visit whenever they came to town, so we could trade stories across generations and rebuild that camaraderie and trust. Of course, there were snacks, because how can you have camaraderie and trust without some food? But we had some difficult conversations in that space. We also, I remember listening to Walt Cunningham tell stories of the early astronaut program and just laughing until I cried together with my community. So I'm grateful for my team that they trusted me to share the need that they had, and I've been so much more aware ever since of the importance of culture and belonging to a high-performing team. Building community, building trust. You can't do any of the other things. You can't have those hard conversations. You can't expect to take and give feedback if you don't build that trust. All right, so the last thing I'll talk to you about is, the last story has to do with self-care, one of the 3 elements of expeditionary behavior. Self-care largely has to do with making sure that you can show up in the best and most complete way possible for your team. No matter where you are in your career, if you're always challenging yourself and striving for growth, you're going to have some knowledge gaps. You're going to make mistakes. I've had moments, I won't say often, but I definitely have had many moments where I've felt like I've fallen flat on my face. And what I use to get up is the phrase, Megan, you get 10 seconds of remorse. And I got that phrase from one of the most memorable bosses I've had in the astronaut office, a man named CJ. He was a Marine Corps fighter pilot and eventual shuttle commander who was not known for being nurturing or even particularly polite. CJ, of course, is not his real name, it's his call sign. So the call sign is a tradition in military aviation communities, especially fighter communities, and the nicknames are often kind of a humorous take on the pilot's personality. In this case, CJ stands for Caustic Jr., because apparently there was someone in CJ's first flying squadron who was even more biting in his commentary, and he was known as Captain Caustic. So Caustic Jr. was not the kind of guy to go to for a hug or a pep talk on a bad day, but he did give, like I said, some of the best advice I've ever received. It wasn't really given as advice, it was more of direction, but we'll take it for what it is. So again, when learning to operate the space shuttle, we spend lots and lots of time together in a simulator. We learn how each system works, how it fails, and how to respond together as a team. So the training gets progressively harder and more complicated. It's designed to overwhelm you. It's designed for you to fail, so that you build up techniques and team skills so that you get better every time. But those failures, they don't ever feel good, right? Especially when you know it was your mistake that let the team down. So from the commander seat, CJ would say, you get 3 seconds of remorse, and then you get back in the fight. Now that I'm no longer operating a spaceship, I give myself 10 seconds. 10 seconds is good. But his point is not that you should forget your mistakes, but that you cannot wallow in them and let them distract you from the main goal. So you take those few seconds, whatever you need, call yourself names inside your head, and then you refocus on the task at hand. After the event was over, we always conduct a debrief. Whatever we do at NASA, we conduct the debrief afterwards. So every person on the team, flight controllers, crew, you have the opportunity to say what went well, what didn't go so well. You acknowledge your own mistakes. You praise the success of your teammates and of the crew. And then you think about, what do I need to do to avoid making those mistakes again? Maybe I need to study more. Maybe I need to hit the books and practice more on my own. Maybe I need to ask someone, hey, next time I move this switch, I need you to back me up, make sure I'm doing it right. Or maybe I need to say, hey, when you're communicating with me, I need you to do it this way instead of that way. That's going to help me do better. Because saying to myself, Megan, you're an idiot, and spiraling down, it doesn't help the team, not ever. But committing to learn from your mistakes and to sharing that knowledge with others helps the team every time. So there you have it, leadership lessons from my life as an astronaut. Number 1, communicate clearly, but leave the sword at home. Number 2, if you're going to fly together, you have to trust each other. And number 3, when you screw up, give yourself those 10 seconds of remorse, but not more. Know that you can learn the lesson and move forward. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you all for being here. Thank you. And again, I encourage you to make the connections, tell each other your stories, start building that supportive community. And we can start by enjoying this wonderful food. Thank you very much.